Hey guys, today we will be talking about the progressives. So progressivism was an optimistic vision and was the idea of progress, that society is capable of improvement. There were many varieties of progressivism. Anti-monopoly was the fear of concentrated power, and these consisted of workers, farmers, and some middle class. There's also social cohesion, which was each person's welfare is dependent on the welfare of society as a whole. This assumption made people concerned about workers and people with hard lives. And third was faith and knowledge, that applying to society's principles of sciences. Okay, on to muckrakers. Muckrakers were among the first to articulate the new spirit of reform, and they were journalists whose goal was to expose scandal, corruption, and injustice. Muckrakers targeted the trusts and railroads, like Ida Tarbell, who wrote about the Standard Oil Trust, and wrote about the government, particularly the urban political machines, like Lincoln Stephens, whose portraits and exposures helped arouse sentiment for urban political reform. Now on to social gospel and the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army was an example of the fusion of religion with reform. Christians offered material aid and spiritual service to the urban poor. Many priests moved to work in the cities. Father John Ryan was a Catholic who worked to expand the scope of Catholic social welfare organizations. The settlement house movement was the belief that the environment influenced individual development. Progressive theorists thought poverty and criminality was based on an unhealthy environment, and to fix this, they need to improve the conditions in which they lived. Jane Addams and the Hull House. They were concerned about the crowded immigrant neighborhoods. One of the first settlement houses was the Hull House in Chicago, which opened because of Jane Addams. It became a model for other settlement houses. Staffed by educated middle class, settlement houses helped immigrant families adapt to the language and customs of their new country. Young college women and unmarried women were important in the settlement house movement. The allure of expertise. Many thought even non-scientific problems could be solved scientifically. Thorstein Veblen, a social scientist, proposed a new economic system where power would be in the hands of highly trained engineers. The professions. The late 1800s saw an expansion of administrative and professional tasks like managers, technicians, and accountants who became a new middle class. The new middle class cared about education and individual accomplishment. And examples of professional associations was the American Medical Association, and by 1920, nearly 2/3 of all doctors were members of the AMA, and the AMA called for stricter standards to become a doctor and more medical education. There were similar movements in other professions, including lawyers, for expanding law schools, the National Association of Manufacturers, and National Farm Bureau Federation for farmers to spread scientific farming methods. Women and the professions. Even though some women were able to become doctors, lawyers, engineers, or scientists, it was extremely hard and rare. And so the female-dominated professions were domestic jobs, like working in the settlement houses, social work, and most important, teaching. 90% of all professional women were teachers, and there were also a lot of women nurses. The New Women. Origins of the New Women. Now that almost all jobs made people work in a factory or office and children were spending more time at school, the house was no longer an all-consuming place. New inventions like running water, electricity made housework less. Also, the family size was declining. There were also single women, and they shunned marriage, and they either lived alone or lived with other women, and these were called Boston marriages when other women lived with each other. Now we will talk about the club women. And there's a women's club movement. Clubs were less concerned with activities and more about social betterment. Many women were wealthy and gave money. The clubs planted trees, supported schools, libraries, and settlement houses, built hospitals and parks. Many women groups also worked with the Women's Trade Union League. On to women's suffrage. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote, "She must have the same rights as all other members, which meant that women deserved the same rights, including the right to vote." But there's also the anti-suffrage movement. Anti-suffragists consisted of both men and women. They thought the women's sphere was to be wives and mothers, and voting challenged this. They linked suffrage with divorce, immorality, and neglect of children. There was the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA. Membership grew from 13,000 in 1893 to over 2 million in 1917. They said mothers and wives had special experiences to bring to public life, and that women's suffrage could make an important contribution to politics. Allowing women to vote would also help the temperance movement because there would be more voters to ban alcohol. By 1919, 39 states let women vote in at least some elections, and the 19th Amendment guaranteed political rights to women throughout the nation. Alice Paul was the head of the militant National Women's Party and did not accept the suffrage sphere justification for suffrage and said the 19th Amendment was not enough. Women needed a more clear amendment that would prohibit all discrimination on the basis of sex. Now we're going to talk about city governments. Before, the middle class and the wealthy did not care much about the city or town government, but now they started taking interest, and they're also urban workers, and they challenged city bosses and saloon owners, brothel keepers, and businessmen who worked with political machines. And there were new forms of governance. The Commission Plan was one of the first major successes, and it was in Texas, where the previous and unable city government was replaced by an elective, non-biased commission. The city manager plan was another approach, and it was where elected officials hired an outside expert, usually a manager or engineer, to take charge of the city government. Tom Johnson was the reform mayor of Cleveland who fought against party bosses and corporate interests. State House progressivism. Many progressives were against state governments because they thought they were corrupt and controlled by party bosses. Reformers looked to circumvent boss-controlled legislatures by increasing the power of the electorate. So there's the initiative and referendum. The initiative allowed reformers to circumvent state legislators by submitting new legislation directly to the votes in general elections. The referendum let actions of the legislature be returned to the election for approval. By 1918, more than 22 states had enacted one or both of these reforms. Direct primary and recall. They tried to limit the power of the party and improve the quality of elected officials. The primary election tried to take the candidates away from bosses and give it to the people. In the South, it was also an effort to limit black voting, since they thought primary voting would be easier to control than general elections. The recall let voters remove a public official from office at a special election if enough people signed a petition. By 1915, every state instituted primary elections for some offices, and only some adopted the recall. Other reform measures tried to clean up legislatures, like banning public officials to accept free passes from railroads. Robert La Follette was the most celebrated state-level reformer. He was the governor of Wisconsin and turned Wisconsin into a laboratory of progressivism. Wisconsin had direct primaries, initiatives, and referendums, regulated railroads and utilities, passed laws to regulate the workplace, and provided compensation for injured workers, and more.